Welcome to our final reflective account on the sports sponsorship course this year. I'm Eddie Couple, and without further ado, let's get into it. So as we come to the end of the year, I think it's kind of best to reflect back on some few points and maybe look at some things that we looked at the beginning of the year and kind of look at the questions or answers behind them now. So in terms of sport marketing practitioner, of course, like I mentioned, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and I still don't entirely, but kind of exploring the world of the sports sponsorship has kind of opened my eyes to sort of a few things and a few paths that are interested in some stuff that I'll continue to look at. One thing that I'm going to look to do next year, as I've mentioned in the previous portfolio in the other classes, so it's my thesis is going to be coming up next year, and I'll be using sort of the things I've picked up on this year to look at the relationship between a brand and a sponsor or an athlete, and maybe hopefully giving some insight and some expertise into that, and how that can be linked to whatever I turn out to do with my topic. So one of the things that I spoke about before is in class, we're encouraged not to just write down and regurgitate information. So it's been I've been given, obviously with this, a great deal of chance to reflect back on my own learning, and within my own notes, I rarely write down what's being said, and I write down questions that I kind of ask myself. So when we're discussing in class, I kind of make a note about how does that affect this, and it's something that I look to do afterwards and after class, and kind of dive into those things. And of course, this portfolio sort of touches on some of those things. And what I like to learn further is more about the process and between a sponsor and a sponsee. And of course, in a perfect world, it would have been perfect for us to actually work with BioSteel and kind of meet with them and talk to them about their needs and what they want to do, and also talk to the Henley Regatta and also understand what they can actually offer, because everything we're doing is just from what we can best research. So if I was able to have a chance to sort of work with a company like that, I think it'd be very, very beneficial. So firstly, I am going to duplicate this slide um, both with the 2P91 reflective account and the 3P251. So if you've watched one already, you just skip ahead in the video, because I'm going to copy them. They're going to be exactly the same, because I think they're both applicable to what I'm going to say in terms of that. So I had the amazing opportunity to meet with Daryl Seidman, who is the head of consumer products in NFL Canada. Professor Chris Chard was very gracious enough to put me in contact with him as an ex-student, and I went to his the NFL Canada office in Toronto, and I just had a meeting with him there, and he was able to get to know me, and I kind of discussed things and kind of let him know what I was interested in, and kind of asked more about what he did and in terms of his job, and how we got from being a graduate from Brock to being the head of NFL consumer products in Canada, and his journey on that, and what he looks for, or what an employer would look for. So I got some real great insight with NFL Canada, and of course, if you've been intimate with these podcasts, you'll know my passion for American football. I could talk a lot about what we talked about. It's great insights, but things I can kind of relate back to the course and to my studies here. One of the things that we discussed was how the NFL were almost grooming certain markets ready for potential investors or um, for an owner to essentially move if they want to. And one of them, the top prime market is the UK. So NFL have been doing a lot of work, and essentially, if an owner wanted to explore options of moving their franchise to another country, the UK would be the most primed market. And we discussed a little bit last episode in terms of the NFL, but they do have strong PR links in both Europe and in the UK, and they've been doing a lot of work there. I think we're going to talk a little bit later, or I may have talked already before, kind of how they're already running football training camps in the UK, and that's already kind of building that culture there, and like I said, priming that market for an owner to move into that team, move into that country. They already have like a great media platform, so the NFL has been shown on the TV a great deal. They got a really good viewership in terms of the Super Bowl and week to week viewership. And then we discussed sort of how to keep fans interested during the off season, because one of the things he asked was kind of how things are in the UK when the season's off. And being in North America, maybe for my first time, obviously during an NFL off season, I've been very intimate towards how, especially with the NFL, that the season really never stops, and the show keeps going on in between free agency and the draft. Now, it happens a lot more in North America. In the UK, everything seems to stop, and I think NFL are gonna, they would be looking at ways of creating essentially that carry on from the end of the season to the beginning of the season, and keeping fans interested. Even my local football, like American football team in the UK, they plan their first sort of taster sessions the weekend after the Super Bowl, so they can kind of take advantage of that spike in sort of in interest. So it'd be interesting to see the moves that sort of NFL will make to kind of make NFL sort of that 365-day engagement and things they can do for that. And of course, lastly, I got a free hat, so I was very, very, very lucky. I cherished that hat, and yes, it was a great experience, and I really appreciate the time. So I just wanted to take a second to kind of share my thoughts on how the sponsorship proposal, kind of went down. So that's kind of all wrapped up now, and I discussed a lot of it before in terms of the things I found out about asset inventory and kind of the work that needs to go into that. And well, I've never done anything like this before in terms of the proposal, so it's been a good process for me, and kind of learning more about that. But like I said before, it'd been in a perfect world we've been able to work with both of the companies and kind of understand more about their goals and what they're trying to achieve. But no, the task itself has been really good, and kind of again opened my eyes to maybe possible things after graduation in terms of sponsorship. And I think one of the things that and what I'm sure these companies do is kind of the research behind it in terms of things like the focus groups and understanding what people think about your brand, and therefore kind of creating and designing a plan about what compiling what you want to do and what and how consumers see you. So those sort of I assume there's those sort of researchers for companies, and there's, kind of their marketing team. They'll do sorts of stuff like that. I think that's quite interesting, to me, because it seems it's something, it's kind of things where you can be communicating with people and meeting new people, meeting new consumers, and being able to kind of relay back to your company about what people think about you, and then from that kind of being able to design about the products, services, or sponsorship proposals, that will best suit the company. So I wanted to share my thoughts on brand and event partnerships, and how they can sort of play off each other. So some work really well. So the Pepsi halftime show, their partnership with that is kind of really embedded. I mean, you can't say the Super Bowl halftime show. It sounds weird. You actually have, it's the Pepsi halftime show, or the halftime show sponsored by Pepsi, the Pepsi Super Bowl Pepsi show, and how that kind of has its own sort of expectations in terms of that, and then things like the FedEx Cup. I mean, although the logo is there, the FedEx Cup doesn't even have the name of the event or even the sport. So their association with that is they're so confident that people will know, or that you'll have to pay attention to FedEx, because you'll be wondering what is the FedEx Cup, or why is it called the FedEx Cup? Why is it not called the FedEx Golf Cup, or the FedEx PGA Tour Cup, or something like that? So it's interesting to see how those things get embedded, and how some sponsors and some events are so confident that you don't even need to say the name, or you can't say the sponsor's name without it. Then I kind of had a looked at the two biggest sporting events year to year is or from the occasion is obviously the FIFA World Cup and the UEFA Champions League, and also the Olympics as well, and how they don't necessarily have a name title. Something like the Mercedes UEFA Champions League. It's something we see. So we'll discuss it a little bit later in the show, but kind of wanted to look at the partnership and prestige, and does one add to the other? So in terms of having a named sponsor, or having a brand or a title sponsor, does that perhaps take away from some of the prestige? Would some fans see the Mercedes Champions League as almost a cheap play by UEFA? And maybe that's why sort of the Olympics and FIFA don't have them. Maybe there's other reasons why. And again, you see it with the fast food companies and versus high-end products. You see with obviously the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl, and the KFC Big Bash League. Of course, I think it depends on the country. So obviously the Big Bash League, it's cricket. It's based in India, I believe, and I think KFC has a different hold there than it does definitely in the UK. I think sure as well with North America, and how sort of the high end products in respect to Chick-fil-A and KFC, you don't see the titles to sponsor. You don't see them as title sponsors as much. So imagine seeing a JP Morgan professional basketball league. You don't see the high-end brands being named sponsors necessarily on events. And I think you can draw some conclusions to sort of the prestige and how perhaps it's seen as being a title sponsor is not something that a top-end company would do. So things a bit more common, like Pepsi, and fast food companies like Chick-fil-A and KFC, and obviously FedEx as a distribution company. Those sort of things you'll see, but high-end things like JP Morgan or Mercedes don't really get involved in title sponsorship. So one of the biggest developments in my learning throughout the entire course and my time here in Canada has been learning or understanding how sponsorship and social identification can work together. And sometimes there's positive aspects and negative aspects, and sport marketers or sport managers need to be sort of savvy to both. So something I brought up in the sport marketing portfolio last semester in terms of Virgin Media. Now, Virgin Media are the one of the main sponsors of Southampton Football Club, and the Southampton Football Club's biggest rivals were Portsmouth, where I study, Portsmouth Football Club. So the Virgin had a billboard in Portsmouth of Southampton players with an advert for Virgin Media. It was something to do with buy this football package, and they had a Southampton player on there, and they got a lot of backlash because obviously it's a rival city. We don't like them, so we don't really want to see them being advertised in our city, in our town. And I think it can, in terms of in terms of identification, social identification, I think it can have a big part. And I think Virgin missed a trick there in terms of that, because now, if I'm a Portsmouth diehard fan, I'm not really want to be interested in Virgin because they, because they have links with my rival team. Now, I think the football culture, or definitely sport culture in the UK, is different. And again, it's something that sport practitioners need to be savvy with. So, the example that we have here with both Manchester teams, United and City, Adidas have to be wary that they may lose a whole selection of fans because of the team they associate with, and the way that English, or perhaps actually all soccer fans, kind of think, and their social identity in that, and they will sort of take on the team so much that they'll avoid certain brands and products that their rival teams associate with. And it's really interesting to see how that, and for me to kind of see how that kind of social identity can lead to that. And essentially, bottom line, could affect your sales if you work it wrong. Then also, what sport managers are good at doing is creating these groups, and we talk about in groups a lot in sort of social identification. So kind of here we have the Neymar's new boots, and they kind of create the hype around it and the appearance around it, and almost you're not cool, or you're not in the in group that you want to be unless you have these boots. And of course that's a for Nike, and for a sport marketing perspective, that's a great mindset for your consumers to have, from when you create this sort of appearance around this product, and people are kind of rushing to get it because they want to, again, have that social identification of being in the group, of obviously having the boots of the top player in the world. So it can work both ways. They can use it to their advantage, and they also need to be aware of how it can be detrimental to their brand. So this is kind of going off the discussion of the NASCAR dance that we talked about in class, and it made me think, or kind of wanted to reflect and share those thoughts about how cultural differences have an effect on marketing ideas, because fans act so differently, and how global sponsors may have to alter their approach depending on their market. Which I think is a fair comment, but let's explore sort of what these look like. So recruitment of talent. So firstly, mainly these cultural differences are mainly versus North American culture versus the rest of the world. So it's North American versus maybe European culture, North American versus Asian, or North American versus Oceania, or something like that. Mainly those are we sort of the cornerstone is sort of the North American culture, and that's where we kind of judge everything off of. So the recruitment of talent. So we'll do sort of the drafts in North American culture versus the academies and something like soccer in Europe. So this kind of helps companies see the next generation of athletes, because there's something like Zion Williams. He's been able to play 1 year at Duke, and he's created a very good platform for himself. And this almost gives you know, a company like, let's say for instance Under Armour, who are going to be able to obviously they're not allowed to do it legally in terms of NCAA rules, but being able to groom this athlete and perhaps gives them a leg up in terms of a safe, or not a safe, but maybe a better planned investment. It's harder to do the same thing in soccer because they're academies and you don't know who is who's necessarily going to be the up and coming, and plus they don't have as many eyes on them because of the way that the sort of the lower tier or lower doesn't get shown, the development doesn't get shown. But in North American sports, we see things like, well, we'll go into it a little bit later, but seeing things like AA and development leagues, and of course NCAA, definitely in football and in basketball as well. So nationalism. So we talked about being more, excuse me, being more patriotic. We talked about patriotism in some classes. And as I mentioned before, in the UK, there's almost seemed to be a pleasure in when the home team loses, and we almost like to take shots at the team or coaches. But it's different in North America. It seems to be a bit more patriotic, and there's a bit more nationalism, or there's a bit more pride in terms of that. So I think that can also have effect on the way sort of brands are shown, and how you know, sponsors look at that in terms of how it's sort of reflected in the society. So local support. So again, in North America, there's a lot more support for like the development team. So the AA, AAA, the rookie, the college sport, of course, and the D leagues. Now, perhaps this is again, I'm going to use the European soccer example, because in England we have a relegation and promotion system. So your team could essentially be in the best, in the top league in the world, and in a few years they can be in the bottom. And I guess this is why there's so much of an emotional roller coaster in terms of that. With something like a AAA team, you know where they're going to be, and you know what they're going to do. It's either winning the championship or losing, or not getting to the final, you know. And there isn't maybe perhaps necessarily a wide spectrum in terms of that. So I think the way that this works is, I think there's a little bit more support, especially with collegiate sport in North America. You're more likely to get a bit more of an allegiance and a positive association with like a AAA team or something like that. So game day experience. So majority of the cultures love to start a game day experience with an alcoholic beverage, and that's something that's consistent among all cultures, excuse me. So that's something that I'm sure the sport practitioners have joy in taking advantage of. I think where it splits, and this is again, it's more soccer than maybe European versus North American, but the segregation of fans, we see it a lot in football, and as you've seen, and as we've discussed in previous videos, how there's almost a hostility, and it's something that perhaps we thrive upon a bit more in the UK, rightly or wrongly, but we like the fact to be in the away team and coming into a town and sing the songs, and kind of doing this us versus them mentality. And like I mentioned in the previous slide, that again crosses over into how savvy you need to be in terms of brands, and knowing that there's that this versus us mentality, and that can cross over onto your product. And then sort of with North American sports, some of them are seen more as an event rather than a sporting contest. So you can take somebody, I think it's to do with the pace of the game. Things like baseball and American football, they tend to have a lot of breaks in the middle, so there's that room for that activation. And even with the NBA basketball, there are sort of breaks, and there's that side of sponsorship activation. So with that versus something a bit more quicker as rugby league or soccer, where the game is there, there to watch the game, 15-minute break, second half, we're out of here. With North American, seems to be a bit more of an event aspect. So with that, sponsors are able to have a little bit more time, and the atmosphere is a little bit different in terms of creating an association with the brand. And finally, inclusion, and there's a question mark here because this is something that I've personally seen and not something that you can maybe necessarily measure, or I can necessarily say is true. But in my experience, I've noticed that females tend to be a bit more confident in their sport identification here in North America than in the UK. Women, they're a bit more involved in sport here, and they're not so much worried about what people think about them. And maybe you talk to somebody else who's from Canada, or even from maybe Australia or something, they'll tell you that maybe that they feel that it's the opposite. But for me, with the campaigns that have been run to try and boost female and black and ethnic minority inclusion in sport in the UK, see that it's definitely with the female that it's not so much as a problem here as it is for my home country. So I know we've discussed new innovations and how that they can assist in sports sponsorship, but I wanted to give a particular focus on virtual reality. It's a bit of an interest in mine, and I kind of want to see how it's going to progress in the next few years, and sort of how different innovations come. So through sort of the VR world, the businesses will actually be able to sort of walk their sponsors through the event physically, in terms of obviously sight and sound. They'll be able to sort of put on this Oculus Rift, and they'll be able to look around and have a look at the perhaps the stadium or the event and how it will look, and kind of walk through the consumer's thing. And unless you can physically obviously create the event beforehand, we haven't been able to do that. But through sort of technology, that's something that they'll be able to do. So it's going to be sort of a risk, but it could be a big swing in terms of revenue, if somebody did want to take a risk. Although it's augmented reality, Pokemon Go has actually turned over 1.2 billion since they've been doing. So they're people do have it, and there is a it has been successful, and could that augmented reality be used in live sport? Perhaps there's maybe not the technology there yet, but it could be very successful. And of course, no one's really done it yet. So there's a lot of space to do. So through the VR, brands are able to be brought to life better. If we can link this into image transfer, having see a brand in VR versus seeing it maybe on paper or maybe on a product may have a bit of image transfer, or better image transfer. And then sort of the first brand to really perfect this through VR will almost be immortalized in sort of next generation marketing. If we take something like Samsung, and they were able to create this interesting sort of maybe image where if you were to put on your virtual reality, and you're able to maybe see the Samsung logo floating around, and you're able to do with it, that they will then forever be put as the standard, and they will, like I said, be almost immortalized in sort of next generation marketing. They were the first to kind of use VR, so there is that opportunity there. Of course, it comes with its risk. And like I said, there's already an audience, so while it's sort of new, it's not foreign to people. People know about it, and a lot of platforms actually support it and are moving into creating other avenues for people to. So, like I mentioned earlier, I wanted to look at sort of the link between athletes and the sponsor, and kind of who helps who and in which way. The comment was made: do athletes even use their own sponsors, or the products that they sponsor? Is it perhaps different with consumable products? Peyton Manning, he's a lovable character. He's a family guy, and also Papa John's have a deal with the NFL, so the fit kind of works perfectly there. And I think we, as consumers, we are not eating pizza because Peyton Manning's eating pizza. He's an athlete, a high level athlete. I think it's okay. I can understand why he doesn't eat the pizza. And for me, that doesn't have much of an effect. You know, it was the example was made with Shaq, Shaquille O'Neal, who is I don't know, 7'3", and I think he's about 300 pounds or whatever. You know, him getting into a Buick almost seems comical. And even though he's sponsoring this car, it's very unlikely that he drives it. But people like his character. People like him, you know, for kind of who he is and what he does. And again, I personally think that, you know, people are not going to drive it because Shaquille O'Neal's driving it. I think definitely fans of basketball understand that that's it's almost physically, it's like I said, it's comical. But then we get to sort of the other products, and we see something like Porsche and Maria Sharapova, and we almost see a shift. And now how the product now adds credibility and prestige to the athlete rather than the other way around. We look at, of course, maybe there's a difference between, you know, because the way that the imaging is done here with her. We've discussed sort of female athletes before and how they are portrayed, but now we look and we see, okay, well, Porsche actually partner up with Maria Sharapova. She must be in the great stage of her career. Like, wow, you know, for her to finally land a you know, a brand like that. And then we'll see things that are a bit more practical, like Roger Federer with Gillette. Of course, you know, he is a clean-cut guy, so, you know, that's a pretty easy transfer for me. He looks good. If I use the product, I'm going to look good. It'd be a bit difficult, or be a bit different if someone was a bit rough and rugged in terms of facial hair, and then advertising the Gillette, obviously shaving brand. It would lead me to question that. You know, I'll try to look at the example of it. Maybe someone like James Harden. But James Harden's beard is a product, it's a brand in itself. But again, then it's actually maintained. So obviously he does use shaving products. So yes, I think, like I said, it's interesting. We almost get to a threshold where the shift changes, and I think that comes with one, with products that aren't sort of physically consumable at all levels, such as food. Because everybody eats food, but not everybody drives a car or a Porsche or a Buick. And then yeah, we get to the level where the brand, because of the prestige of it, then adds credibility and its own prestige to the athlete. So I think this is a fantastic example of how different markets will market their product differently. So we'll take the video game FIFA 14. Of course, it's football, soccer. And you can see just the range of cover athletes and how they differ depending on what country that the game's been sold in. So you'll see, obviously Messi is always there in all the covers, because obviously he's a world superstar, you know, and you know, we'll have players from sort of lesser known countries such as bottom left Poland with Robert Lewandowski. He's obviously Polish, and he's one of the greatest Polish forwards of all time, and they'll put him on the cover, while a country like Austria, if you look on the top, second from the left, with David Alaba. Again, Austria is not known for necessarily having too many world-class players, let alone enough to do their own cover. But in Austria, they'll put the star on the front of it, and you'll see it across many other countries. Obviously, Tim Cahill in Australia on the bottom there, and you know, Gareth Bale on the top for many of the UK games. So definitely, it's a great way to see how different markets and how something something as simple as a video game can be marketed completely different depending on the market. And lastly, I just wanted to share some thoughts on sort of athlete retirement and how sponsors can kind of play a part in that, or kind of attempt to sort of partner up with that. So we've been seeing a lot of, I've been noticing a lot with Dwayne Wade recently, who's recently just retired, played his final game as a Miami Heat. And we've seen, I saw a lot of clever activations with the number 3. So of course you can see in this logo, and even during the event, the last game in Miami, a lot of the sponsors were doing something around the number 3. So I can't recall the brand, but I know there was a company that gave away free. I think they were a juice company, gave free juice to everyone who's in section 301, 305, and it's something to do with the number 3. And it's kind of how we've seen teams take advantage of a great player such as Dwayne Wade, and that can be used to sort of help sell certain things to sponsors, and our sponsors will also use that. And I think it does create a good association with fans, because they're there for Dwayne Wade, they're there for the number 3, and it creates a good positive association with that brand. And with that, we've finally come to the end of the year and this reflective count. So thank you very much if you've made it this far. I hope you found the insight enjoyable and a little bit different. I'd certainly have. So thank you very much for sticking with me here. And yes, thank you very, very much, and all the best.